Hello, everyone. My name is Filippo Taddei. I'm associate professor of practice in international economics at SAIS, and I'm very happy to host the conversation today by my colleague and director, Michael Plummer. Professor Michael Plummer is the Emmy Professor of Economics at School of Advanced International Studies and also the director of SAIS Europe, the European campus of the school. Michael is a rare combination of scholarly work, policy advice, and policy involvement. In his professional career, in his professional career, he's been focusing on trade, especially within the Asian region. He has been the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Asian Economics for 8 years, and he's been consulting different multilateral organizations and government in the process of facilitating integration, in particular trade integration and trade agreement. Is really the right person that you could be looking for if you want to understand more about what's going on in the most populated continent in the planet, and possibly the most interesting from an economic point of view in the years to come, which is Asia. So, without any further delay, let me just leave the floor to Mike for his presentation. After Professor Plummer's presentation, we'll be opening up the floor for questions. Please, if you have any questions, don't forget to write it in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Filippo. Let me get the slide working. Are we there?
Yes.
See it? Okay, great.
Good.
Anyway, it's wonderful to be here talking to you about Southeast Asia and the current situation. I think that it's, we often, I think when we talk about Asia, tend to focus a lot on Northeast Asia, especially China, Japan, even Korea, given the great example that Korea has set in terms of its approach to COVID-19, but we hear a lot less about what's going on in Southeast Asia. So what I'd like to do today is focus on that region, specifically on the 10 countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. I'm going to focus more on the economic consequences. Being an economist, that's probably the only thing I'm really qualified to do. But of course, when we talk about policy, we need to approach it from different perspectives. So we'll also be talking about policy and policy initiatives. I should emphasize that we really don't have decent economic data yet. This thing is very new, but we do have some forecasts and some general trends that seem to be pretty obvious to everyone. So we do have some forecasts, though we need to be careful interpreting them. I'll start with the short-term consequences of COVID-19 for the region in a changing external environment before looking at some of what I would consider to be the longer-term issues that facing the region, with the main takeaway that cooperation in the region and proactive policy will be essential in addressing ongoing uncertainties and conflict. And I think that if Filippo were giving this seminar about Europe, he would probably come to the same conclusion. It's just that in ASEAN, it's a bit of a different animal. So it's that's where we're going to be looking at today. Okay. Now, to the degree to which the pandemic has hit the ASEAN region really has varied a lot from country to country. For example, Singapore has the largest number of positive cases at about 20,000. And this is followed by Indonesia with a little over 12,000 at present, and the Philippines with 10,000. And of course, in the case of Singapore, as you may have seen, a lot of it has to do with spikes. The most recent spike due to an outbreak in some dormitories and these sorts of things. But in any event, we have had positive cases in all of the ASEAN countries. Interestingly, Vietnam has no deaths attributed to COVID-19 and only 271 cases in a country of 96 million. and which is actually very remarkable. And of course, data are problematic in the region, as they are everywhere, but this is really indicative of something that's pretty remarkable. And Vietnam did have some very decisive policy actions to try to address any outbreak as they began to emerge. The fatality ratios, deaths to positive cases, range from 0 in Vietnam and the Lao People's Democratic Republic to 7.2 in Indonesia. In Italy, that ratio is 13.8. But I want to emphasize that, of course, in developing countries, including in Asia, the healthcare systems are far less prepared to deal with these COVID cases. We've got problems with testing, and it is so looking too carefully, believing too much of these data is probably not a good idea, but I think it is indicative of a problem in the region, but it's been much worse elsewhere. Also, certainly the region is not over it, including in Cambodia. On May 4th, the World Health Organization issued a warning that the country of Cambodia was at risk for a second wave. And even if there hadn't been any new cases there since April 12th, and the same is true of Lao PDR. Okay, so in conclusion, remember the ASEAN region. Even though we don't hear about as much as we do China or India, it still has 650 million people, or 50% larger than the EU. It's fared relatively well in terms of the pandemic. Just to give you a comparative view. This is something that I saw in the Nikkei Asia Review. It sort of puts in a comparative context. Up here, up top, you see what's happened in India. And India had this highest number of positive cases that came out towards the end of April. Singapore is down here. It was on April 21st that we saw that spike, but again, the country has been addressing it quite aggressively. And the rest of the countries are relatively low here. So those are the direct effects. However, there are a lot of indirect effects of this pandemic as it affects the world economy. The Asian Development Bank estimates that Southeast Asia will grow by 1% this year, which is down from a 4.5% range since 2015. And it's estimating that it will go back up to 4.7%. So it's forecasting a relatively quick recovery. The only country this year that's predicted to fall into recession is Thailand, and it's a pretty deep recession. It's predicted to contract by 4.8% this year before rebounding to 2.5% in 2021. As I mentioned in a moment, a lot of this has to do with tourism and things that are linked to services. So ASEAN is particularly exposed to trends in the global economy. And so one has to place a large confident interval around those estimates. If we the problem with these forecasts, we're looking at point estimates, and we really do have a big range that we need to consider, especially for ASEAN because it's so exposed to trade. The region traded GDP is over 100% in ASEAN, which compares to 47% in Latin America and 54% in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's very much exposed to the international marketplace. And in fact, ASEAN economic cooperation really emerged from a need to integrate more, not just across countries, but globally. So I think it's been unique in terms of regional organizations that have prioritized cooperation as a means of competing better at the global level, because intra-ASEAN economic integration was much less than its trade with the external environment. So therefore, ASEAN had the goal of strengthening its economies, bringing down barriers, and fostering cooperation in order to compete better globally. And that's really at the essence of economic cooperation in ASEAN. And COVID-19 is a problem for that because of the major shock it will have to trade. The WTO last month forecast a decrease of 13 to 32% of trade this year. And if you think about it, that's a pretty big range. That's what I'm saying. You need a confidence interval. If you're doing these estimates and you've got a region where trade to GDP is 100%, and you forecast that global trade will fall by 13%, you're going to get a very different number if you insert 32%. So how you choose that is going to be is going to determine exactly what your overall growth rates are going to look like. Okay. Trade is expected to rebound again next year, but of course that's going to be uncertain. The biggest drops that the WTO identifies will be in sectors with complex value chains and trade and services due to restrictions on transport and travel. And these are exactly the areas where ASEAN is very dependent. I mentioned Thailand and tourism, for example, but also value chains, as I'll mention in a minute, are very important to the trade and growth strategy of the region. Because of these things, consumer and business confidence are taking a major hit. So even though you might say that trade is only one aspect of economic integration, it has an important bearing also on consumer confidence and business confidence. And if you've got a big hit to consumer spending and a hit to investment, this also will be a problem, not just for this year, but also for next year. So the future paths in the short run continue to be highly uncertain, even though some of us might take some relief in the fact that the growth estimates are not too dramatic, like compared to Italy, which I believe is expected to contract by 9% this year. Just to give you an idea of what these growth rates look like, this came out a few weeks ago. These are IMF estimates of quarterly GDP growth. The red lines relate to emerging market and developing economies, and the dark lines to advanced economies. The previous estimates, right? The last time the World Economic Outlook came up, this was the estimate of where the growth rate would go. Okay, so this is pre-COVID-19. With COVID, you've got a sharp drop and certainly through 2020, but then you have a pickup in emerging markets, I'm sorry. In developed countries, you have even more accentuated drop in growth due to COVID before you have a recovery. And notice, as we'd expect, that even after you have the recovery, the trajectory is still going to be at a lower rate. Okay, this was before with the previous World Economic Outlook estimates. Now for emerging and developing countries, it's going to be less. So that's a hit. And these are the trade growth numbers that the WTO put out last month. And there's a few things that I think are interesting from this graph. And well, first, since we're talking about COVID, what we see is this is the big drop that the WTO is estimating in world growth in trade this year, and then the rebound next year. Okay, so this is in the pessimistic scenario, that 32% hit that I was talking about. And this is the more optimistic scenario, but you still see a pretty big hit. But what is more interesting when we're talking about trade is even what was happening beforehand. Trade actually fell slightly, but still had negative growth last year. And if you compare it to trends that were taking place before the global financial crisis, this is what the trend looked like. And so if it had continued that way, this is where global trade growth would have gone. But you had this huge hit during the financial crisis. And then that permanently, it seemed, had a shock that decreased this trend growth rate. So even this is much less than before. So even before COVID, we're looking at a shock to trade that is something that's of concern to ASEAN. So why was this trade falling? There's a number of reasons, but one, of course, has to do with trade tensions, the US-China trade war, but also protectionism, across the board last year. It was not a good year for trade. Also regional production networks and supply chains have been slowing. They've started to mature. So that was one of the reasons why you saw this big increase before. It had to do with these regional production networks. Those are maturing and they become less of a potent force in terms of driving growth, even though from an industrial organization point of view, they're important. And of course, this is the big problem for ASEAN, which is heavily embedded in these production networks, but also ASEAN counts on it as a way of closing development gaps. And what I mean by that is when we have these production networks, you've got multinationals that fragment production across borders. And so what that means in ASEAN, it's such a diverse region that you have a country like Singapore, which has a per capita income on par with the United States, and then you have least developed countries like Cambodia. Well, what multinationals can do within ASEAN is they can do higher end production in Singapore, in Malaysia, and to some degree, Thailand and the Philippines, and very labor intensive work in the least developed countries. And the region as a strategy is using that as a way of trying to build up the poor countries. And those would be Cambodia, Lao PDR, Myanmar, and Laos. And that's a way of plugging them into these modern production networks. And there's a lot of very important knock-on effects from that. You know, they get to, there's technology transfer, they're able to access ready-made markets, and they're able to take advantage, if you will, from globalization. And if you look at the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint, in other words, its implementation, there's a major section that literally counts on these regional production networks to close these development gaps across borders. So that's very important. That's very significant. Now, FDI flows, it turns out prior to COVID, and actually even prior to last year, because, you know, FDI data come out later, but it's actually been a very strong success story. It rose to $155 billion in FDI inflows in 2018 from $147 billion in 2017. These are numbers that came out at the end of last year, November. The stock of inward foreign direct investment in the region more than doubled from 2000 to 2018, from 3.5 billion to 7.4 billion. Foreign direct investment flows, just for comparison to China, were actually less than they were to the ASEAN region in 18 and in 17. There were 139 billion and 134 billion respectively. So it's been a region that was actually attracted a lot of foreign investment and the benefits that accrue to that sort of investment. There were signs, however, at the end of 2019 that some equity portfolios were starting to moderate last year. So maybe when new FDI information comes up, we're going to see lower flows, but it's been a success story compared to trade. I might also mention too that for you macroeconomists out there, the exchange rates, the currency of some economies did fall significantly beginning with the COVID-19 shock. This is especially true for Indonesia and Thailand, had big depreciations of their currencies. Now, in terms of the distribution of FDI flows, 1/3 of it goes to manufacturing, 2/3 goes into services, that's especially in financial services, wholesale retail trade, and things that are very much embedded in these production networks. About half, if you look at an annual basis, it's kind of interesting to see between 40 and 50% generally of foreign direct investment that goes into ASEAN, half of it goes to Singapore. So it's a major hub in that, in the region. And obviously that's why Singapore is predicted to also have a big hit this year of contracting by 3.5% due to the COVID shock. So question is, you know, what's going to happen post-COVID? You could have a situation where ASEAN continues to have big shares, but bigger shares of smaller pies with less foreign direct investment globally. So the conflict in the global trading system, and now I'd like to go more towards the longer term. rather than just talk about what's happening with COVID, because in a way, COVID is simply expediting a trend that was already in motion. As most of you probably know, there's been an impasse at the WTO, which had posed a special problem for Asia, which depends more on the global marketplace than the other regions. There's been no successful multilateral liberalization single undertaking since the mid-1990s, when the world economy was very, very different, and we haven't had new rules. Also in the past, the global trading system has depended on US leadership, and yet the current US leadership has many problems with multilateralism, the WTO, and is essentially blocking the dispute settlement mechanism, which is right now at an impasse, perhaps temporarily, but is currently at an impasse. Okay. It's true that some countries in the region, and Vietnam is often cited for this, that they've benefited to some degree due to the US-China trade war. But I'd argue that's very short term, and it's very difficult to glean this from the data because there was structural change taking place in China anyway. Even before the trade war, you were seeing multinationals moving out of China and into Vietnam, and even Chinese multinationals moving to Vietnam because of rising wages in China and the will to diversify more. Now, the phase one agreement of the US-China agreement gave some hope for stability, but the recent COVID-19 related posturing and phase two problems have created fears that there's going to be long-term disruption. So again, this is speeding up this process to some degree of moving out of China. And even though you could see some short-term benefits of this, on the whole, ASEAN is going to be negatively affected by the uncertainty and the rise in protectionism globally. And if you add into that the COVID-19 uncertainty, and you can imagine that the ASEAN leaders are quite nervous about what's going to happen in the future. Now, could ASEAN cooperation serve to help this process? And perhaps, but it can only do so much. If you look at ASEAN trade, for example, these are ASEAN export destinations selected over several years from 2001 to 2018. These are major trading partners. Intra-ASEAN trade was up last year in 2018 to about 28%, but that's still about 1/4 of total trade, a little over 1/4 of total trade, whereas intra-EU trade, for example, is 2/3. Indeed, ASEAN's biggest trading partner is with in these data anyway, the 28 countries of the European Union. The United States and Japan are becoming less important, and China rose quite a bit, but most recently it's gone down some. So the point being here is that it's not as though ASEAN is just focused inwardly like the EU could be. It has to worry about what's going on globally. And it's also difficult for the region to project joint positions given the diversity of the regional interests and relatively weak institutions to develop these positions. The European Union is an economic union with a long history of cooperation, far more symmetric interests, and a greater weight in the global economy, and so therefore more market power, and yet it too is challenging what it can do at the global level. So the ASEAN countries have turned to regional fora to try to advance these issues, and it's not always as a group. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, which was the TPP without the United States. It includes 4 members of ASEAN, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And then more recently, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, is actually ASEAN-centric. In fact, to be part of that arrangement, a country has to have a free trade area in place with ASEAN. So there were 16 countries, but now there are only 15 since India pulled out, but it's ASEAN plus Northeast Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Okay, and so the idea is with these agreements, you would not only have greater market access, but you would set new rules for commerce in the 21st century, and as well as promoting positive strategic interest within the region. Our estimates, and I'll mention these in a moment, suggest that cooperation will more than compensate even for the US-China trade war, and China will, in the end, be a big loser economically, but will gain strategically by being part of RCEP, whereas the US will lose economically, not by as much, but its strategic influence will continue to wane. So if we look at this in our modeling, and this is in a paper that's coming out next week to be published by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, we do two sets of scenarios using a computable general equilibrium model. One in which we don't have a trade war, which is business as before, and the other is with the trade war. And since we're with the trade war right now, let me look at those numbers. We estimate that this big hit that takes place because of the phase one, even at phase one levels, will lead to a hit of $301 billion for the global economy every year. And beginning in 2030, but the CPTPP agreement would get some of that back, about a third of it back. You add in the RCEP benefits, and you more than compensate it, include India into RCEP, and that's still a goal of some of the RCEP countries, and you even go further up. So in a way, if you will, this sort of cooperation on the whole can compensate for that conflict. And looking at some of the numbers, the US, for example, is estimated to take a $23 billion permanent hit beginning in 2030. That is exacerbated by the TPP without the United States through trade diversion, et cetera, to the tune of another 12 billion. So that's $35 billion hit. And if RCEP comes in, it gets some of that back due to some positive harmonization effects from the RCEP agreement. But on the whole, the US loses from all of this. China takes a very large hit from the US-China trade war. As a matter of fact, it takes most of the hit. So Donald Trump was right when he was saying that would be the case. It takes even more of a battering if you only have the CPTPP because China is not a member. When you add on to that RCEP, so in which China is a member, it gains back about $100 billion a year and slightly more if you've got India. So in the end, out of all this cooperation, China's better off with the cooperation, but it still takes a major economic hit that's left over from the trade war. But if you look at the ASEAN countries, they tend to do actually quite well in these scenarios in terms of cooperation. They were hit somewhat from the trade war. There were some slight benefits, okay, $3 billion in terms of gains to Vietnam with the US-China trade war, but that's very small. But when you have the various levels of cooperation, you get much bigger gains for a country like Vietnam. Singapore, because of its role as a hub in the middle of the region, takes a $3 billion hit with the trade war, but it gains a lot when we have deeper cooperation. Of course, Singapore is a member of both those economies, both of those regional cooperative organizations. All right, so just to give some concluding comments, COVID-19 will have a strong negative effect on trade in the short run. How much, we're not sure. But really, it's expediting changes already in motion in terms of supply chains, and these will have even longer term implications. The case for closer cooperation is made stronger by COVID-19, but that doesn't mean it will bring countries together, and certainly isn't doing so in the key US-China context. In other words, just because there's a strong economic incentive doesn't mean it's going to happen. And I think it's very interesting, for example, if you look at RCEP and the question of India, Japan, for strategic reasons, is trying to pull out all the stops to bring India back into the agreement, even though actually Japan loses economically to some degree with us, with India in the agreement, whereas China just wants to move forward, and yet it would be better off within the agreement. But again, it's not the economics that is dictating policy. There are so many other considerations. Okay, there's a chance that this conflict could have permanent effects. Unfortunately, you could think of it as economic distancing, separation, from the United States, from the region. When APEC was originally founded, Secretary of State Baker said he wanted to do it to prevent a line from falling down the Pacific, but it seems that that might be the case right now. And frankly, this is the last thing that ASEAN wants. ASEAN does not want to choose sides. And so it's put in a very uncomfortable situation. So, but in any event, deep cooperation can to some degree help overcome some of the negative effects of the conflict. And in any event, post-COVID, strengthening rules with respect to export controls and better than neighbor policies will need to be a priority, even though they're complicated to solve. Sometimes we need to have those rules in place, and with some leadership, we can get there. So, Filippo, let me stop there.
Thank you, Mike. As you were talking, we were already getting the first question, so let's kick our conversation going, building on your presentation. So let's start with two questions here. The first one is about projection, in a sense of the forecast. So we know that Asia in general, but the Asian, Asian in particular, is very dependent on trade. So, or external demand, or trade integration, or external demand. And, we know that one of the consequences of this lockdown crisis is that some of the markets will take some time to reopen. So external demand might lag behind. You would expect, or you could expect, that this would have actually a stronger impact on the ASEAN region compared to others. And this is not what the forecast predicts. So, or isn't that a little bit counterintuitive? So can you help us understand better where these different might come from? Why countries that, or economies that we typically think of as more dependent on trade seem to be more resilient after a crisis that has disrupted trade and will keep on disrupting trade? Second question is more about long term, and it's about the China Belt and Road Initiative. We know that is the possibly biggest investment initiative in the region. And, if we think about trade disintegration because of the lockdown crisis, what about this major multi-year investment? What about the impact of COVID-19 on this initiative, okay? It's both economically and possibly also from a strategic point of view, given in terms of the kind of equilibrium that will be delivered in Asia. I would start from here, Mike, from these two questions, and then we'll take the other.
Okay. All excellent questions. And that's absolutely true that we should expect the region to be hit more, because since it's more dependent on the global marketplace, that it will get a stronger hit. And these are not my macro forecasts, right? It's the IMF and the ADB does the same thing. And so it is I would say that probably the reason this comes out is that many of these forecasts, what's going on in the region is going to depend to some degree on China. And these organizations are forecasting a recovery in China that'll be much faster than, say, Europe and the United States, even though Europe is obviously very important for ASEAN. So you're going to have some, if you will, perhaps some poles of growth that will help offset the very strong negative impact. And I think you have to be sympathetic to these modelers. I mean, the numbers that my co-author and I have run using a CG model, this is a long-term forecast. And so that's a lot easier to do than something that's going to be short-term. And if I'm doing that modeling, I've got to ask myself, okay, when is this all going to end? And I don't know how many people we have out there. I'm not sure. No one out there, I think, could tell us when it's going to end. We're very hopeful here in Italy that we've We've seen the beginning of the end, but we don't know about second waves. We don't know how that's going to come out. You know, the United States is a major factor, major engine in the global economy. There is a lot of risk-taking taking place in the United States. Will that pay off or just the opposite? I'm not sure. And if I'm a modeler, which way do I go with that? You know, I personally think that they're probably going on the more optimistic end. So that's why I was saying this is, you know, that those confidence intervals need to be very large. I do want to add one more thing, though. Remember, when I say that ASEAN's trade to GDP is 100%, remember there's a lot of double counting in that process because of these regional production networks. In a way, that graph I showed you that was happening prior to the financial crisis, you saw that great uptick in trade in part because of double counting. Because if you are just, you know, exporting an automobile from the United States to China, you know, that's only going to be, you know, it'll show up as, you know, a $10,000 car is $10,000 export from the United States, a $10,000 import from China, and globally that's a $20,000 value altogether. But if you're breaking that up into, I think that even the Ford Escort had components of 44 different countries. If you've got these things crossing borders frequently, it's not going to be 20,000. It might be 4 times that. And so it becomes 80,000. So when the global financial crisis hit, you had a huge implosion of trade that was many times, in ASEAN anyway, many times what the shock was to income, in part because that was bad data. And this is why the OECD and the WTO launched the Trade and Value Added Project to sort of look at trade and value added rather than what we see in terms of this problem of double counting. So we need the value added. For example, it's traded GDP in Singapore is 400%. So, and Singapore has a very large domestic component. So you don't see traded GDP is 400%. That means the country is exposed to international trade more than many other countries. But remember, it's a developed country effectively. And so trade and services is very important. And a lot of that is domestic demand. That's not going to be as negatively affected as some of the trade flows. So I'm sure there's some of that also in the numbers. And I think that this is, I think it's probably true. It's been shown empirically that countries that are more outward oriented are more resilient. They may take a bigger short-term shock, but they come out of it much more quickly. In fact, as I recall with the Asian financial crisis, Singapore was hit very hard in the fall of 2018 after 2008 when Lehman Brothers fell. And if I remember correctly, it was contracting at something like 12% in that last quarter by the time we hit New Year's. But then by the first quarter of 2009, it was already up and running. It was already coming back. And I think that remembering the benefits of the global marketplace also addresses some of the concerns about the future of value chains and protectionism. A lot of people, I'm reading a lot of this, and people are saying, hey, companies, they're not going to trust global value chains anymore. If an Italian company of, you know, making ventilators in Italy has to rely on parts from Germany, and Germany says they're going to have export controls, well, then I'm not going to rely. I want to source locally. And that would be really a problem, because if you're only sourcing locally, first of all, that limits the number of suppliers you have. You're going to be less competitive because you have less international competition. And there's a lot of other, you know, less choice in terms of what those inputs would be. So you would do much better to work on better rules against things like these export controls, which we've seen. And Europe responded quickly to those tendencies, like the tendencies for, you know, Germany not to export to other European countries some of these PPEs. And that was settled, but only at the European level, not to out extra European exports. And we've got to rethink that. And that really is a problem. In terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, that's a great question about what the implications are going to be. And I think in the short run, we're going to see a pause in what's going on in the Belt and Road. I remember during the Asian financial crisis, it always stuck in my head that one ASEAN official said about ASEAN cooperation that it's hard to worry about your garden when your house is on fire. And in a way, these new initiatives, exciting as they are, right now people are worried about the immediate future rather than the long-term tendency towards, laying down this infrastructure for the future. But having said that, I think that once you see greater certainty in the international marketplace and you have less risk, it's going to pick up again and it's going to move forward. And I think in part because China has shown a very strong willingness to push forward with these international initiatives and things. I think there's going to be both political and economic push, a big political and economic push from China to move forward. But I think this year is going to be a good year for the Belt and Road.
Thank you, Michael. A few questions are coming up, so let me just go a little bit one by one so that we have the time to address all of them. Okay. So this is more about now policy in the ASEAN region. What kind of long-term consequences? If we do expect that because of the current shock of the lockdown crisis and its consequences, we will be these countries will be able to rely less on their traditional export market. You mentioned in your response before that the European market, for instance, is especially important for these countries. What will we make out of this? Should we expect the region to turn more toward integration with China, so to try to adjust its production and deal it more with China, so create some tighter integration, tighter trade integration within Asia and less reliance on other markets out of Asia? Is that something? Or, should we expect rather the opposite, some people are worried that this would actually trigger complete disintegration of trade. And some of these countries that have traditionally built their development model on trade expansion might actually turn to their domestic market, might turn to some sort of protectionism, some subsidization of their domestic demand or supply for their domestic market. Where is this? So, are these concerns reasonable to you? More reliance on Asian market, or actually even more reliance on domestic market, and so full trade integration?
Okay, I think the effect of COVID-19 will likely be a push towards closer regional integration. I think that the RCEP Accord was set earlier this year, was really set to be signed by the end of this year, and then COVID hit. And so it's very difficult to score these deals through Zoom, right? We can give economic seminars, but sometimes doing trade deals, it's complicated. So it's going to be delayed, but I think that the need to do it is going to actually increase. The need to create more certainty in markets. And even though RCEP isn't as deep as the CPTPP, it does impose new disciplines. It does allow for greater market access. It does allow for greater certainty in certain sectors and things. And I think there's going to be a strong demand to move forward in those areas. And it's very difficult to believe that once they do this, that they won't be integrating more with China. Southeast Asia will integrate more with China. The RCEP is deeper than the ASEAN China Free Trade Area. It's going to go forward. But I think the big difference, the big change that you're going to see with RCEP is not so much Southeast Asia with China, it's going to be Northeast Asia. With our numbers, RCEP is really, the big numbers come from a free trade area between China, South Korea, and Japan. Because these countries don't have a trilateral free trade area. They've had negotiations, they haven't done it. There is a very, very shallow free trade area between South Korea and China that is not used much because they've been negotiating RCEP. And with our numbers, we see a huge increase in economic integration between China, Japan, and South Korea. And I'll remind everybody that Japan and South Korea are major US allies, and they're going to be brought in even closer to China. So I think it's hard to, once this thing moves forward, and I think there's a strong political and economic justification for it, you're going to see a greater gravity of growth in the region that's going to be within Asia. And this has this problem of this economic distancing from the United States. So in a way, that's one way of thinking of the link. You've got COVID-19 that increases this need, and this is going to have an effect of exacerbating potentially this line down the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that it is a concern, obviously, that you could have protectionism that's triggered in the context of what's going on. But this is really a fight that the region had a while ago, and I don't see it's coming back. I think that the idea of economic integration through trade is firmly embedded in the development strategies of ASEAN countries. That doesn't mean there's not going to be problems. There's problems in Europe. There's problems in NAFTA. There's always going to be problems. But I think deeply, I don't think that anyone in the region, including Myanmar and Cambodia, that thinks that domestic markets are any sort of substitute for international markets, in particular because these markets are so small and the potential benefits globally are so large. And so benefiting from them is important. So I do not see, in terms of trade, any backlash. Now, in terms of financial integration, as I think everybody knows, that Southeast Asia has been much less enthusiastic about financial liberalization after the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. So the openness, increasing openness in finance, probably won't proceed at pace, but it's been limited anyway. If you look at the ASEAN economic community, that word economic community is, comes with the baggage of the European economic community and the four freedoms: free flow of goods, free flow of services, free flow of skilled labor, not unskilled labor, which wouldn't be possible, as well as a freer flow of capital. And if you look at the details, it isn't the only freer flow of capital is really foreign direct investment. It's not financial integration. So that's not controversial. I could see that not deepening, but that's already there. That's not going to be a big change.
Thank you, Mike. Two more. What about form of government, or actually style of government and response to the coronavirus from our colleague Mark Gilbert? And the second one about the optimism, possibly the optimism in the crowd. So the first question is, should we think that maybe some sort of authoritarianism might facilitate the response to the current crisis? So should we think that countries like Singapore, because of their form of government or their style of government, will be better equipped to respond? This is from our colleague Mark Gilbert. And then the question from the optimist of the crowd, which is, well, maybe this is an opportunity to scale up the segment of international production that Southeast Asia currently is in. We think because if that area of the world cannot rely on the European market and North American market as much as it did in the past, because their economy might be slower, or the trade war might be actually very more stronger than expected, then it could turn that they have to move out from the current segment of production where they are, and actually start to upgrade, start to get into higher value-added segment of the supply chain. Is this too optimistic? Is this a possible scenario? Is this something that you envision? On these two, Mike, back to you.
Okay. On Mark's question, I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but I think that it would be very difficult to draw any conclusions that would apply to all countries. Take China, the Chinese response. I think that what you saw is a lot of people saying that the authoritarian regime in China was able to more quickly impose the lockdown and control it for the good of the people, if you will, after that. And so this has been hailed as an authoritarian, an argument in favor of saying the authoritarian market is better. But, you know, there's the other question about why it took so long to discover this thing. And so there's certain problems of the, you know, authoritarian regime in terms of when things get reported. And, you know, if the Chinese government knew about in December, and had not been an authoritarian regime, perhaps that would have come out quicker. And so then that draconian lockdown would not have been as necessary, and it certainly wouldn't have spilled out more. So I think China gives both examples of the strengths and weaknesses. But look at South Korea. I don't think any country really has done a better job in controlling it than South Korea. And South Korea is a vibrant democracy. Singapore, you know, obviously is going to have some advantages in terms of its way of trying to control COVID, but it's also invested in, you know, universal healthcare. It's got excellent hospitals, and it's been prepared for this sort of a thing. And its regime is a bit sui generis. And as I mentioned, if you look at the outbreaks, they tended to be in, you know, dormitories and these things that were easier to deal with. So I think it really depends on the regime, frankly, that it's difficult to say things unambiguously one way or the other. I mean, try to compare Italy and the United States, for instance, in this regard. It makes it interesting. And Italy was able to go into a lockdown pretty quickly, and even for regions that were not as affected as some of the northern regions were. And, you know, it's a democracy, and it was able to do actually what I would argue, I think will prove to be a pretty effective way of doing it. The United States is having more challenges. It's got a lot of diversity in terms of the responses of the states. It's getting conflicting messages, it seems, from the federal level. And it's, you know, it's not all democracies are the same, if I may say. So I'm not sure. Again, I'm not an expert on that. In terms of the opportunity to move up the value chain with, you know, less trade flow, you know, less connection with Europe and, say, the United States, I think that it is. I could see the point if I'm understanding it correctly, that it would force Asia to trade internally more. But remember, you've got a tremendous amount of diversity anyway in terms of the of value added and you know, higher end and lower end production in ASEAN, but also throughout Asia. If you look at RCEP, for example, you've got Japan, which is Japan, South Korea, OECD countries that are very developed. You've got China, which is very developed in certain areas, less so in others. Within ASEAN, as I mentioned, you've got Singapore and certain pockets of big innovation in ASEAN, but you also have least developed countries. And so I think you've got that tendency that's already there. And, you know, my own prediction is that you're not going to see any kind of stark change post-COVID. You're simply going to see trends that are going to be expedited that were taking place beforehand. And that's going to be, you know, greater, you know, inward orient, you know, trade, intra-ASEAN, intra-Asian trade, and less trade perhaps with the US. The EU, it's hard for me to say. You know, true, there's an income shock, but the EU has a major presence in ASEAN in terms of foreign direct investment. As we saw from those data I presented earlier, it's by far the biggest trading partner of the region. And, you know, Europe has negotiated free trade areas with, say, Singapore and Vietnam, and has, you know, sat down with ASEAN itself. And so it's not as though Europe is sitting on its laurels and just waiting for this to happen, looking inwardly. Actually, Europe has been fairly active in trying to reach out to the region and to build those bridges. So I expect that to continue. I would, of course, believe that you're going to see rising intra-Asian trade, if for anything, simply because Asia is growing more rapidly. If you know, you're a country that is, an exporting country, and you've got the EU, which is growing at 1%, and you've got Asia that's growing at 6%, obviously you're going to start trading more with Asia, just purely from that income effect. So this is one of the reasons why you've seen this gravity has shifted to Asia.
Thank you, Mike. It is actually great to move to our final question in the last 3 minutes that we have here. And so you showed in your presentation how the different trade agreement, different types of trade agreement, of regional trade agreement, will have an impact on income growth as we look into the long run. And so what's the source of that? I mean, our attendees are curious to know what is the main driver of this income increase or income drop? It is just what you mentioned, in a sense, an increase in the amount of trade, which is beneficial. So it's just a volume effect, more trade. Is it the fact that the trade carries more investment to these countries? Is it not really the quantity, but the quality of trade? So it's the effect that you estimate of specialization. So if you could be more specific about the origin of those forecasts from your model that you talked about, that would be, I think, appreciated by our audience.
Okay, sure, I'll try. The model gets kind of complicated. Remember, these computable general equilibrium models are long-run models. So, for example, what's going on is we have first a baseline, which is determined by growth projections that we have from various organizations, be it the IMF and other organizations that give us these forecasts going into the future. You have a forecast of productivity and these sorts of things, and that gives you a baseline. And then you put in these marginal shifts in trade policy that would affect, economic interactions. And you allow these things to be implemented according to the agreements when it says it's going to happen, and to the extent of the agreements. And so some of those things are easy to quantify. If on the CPTPP you're dropping tariffs, 96% of tariffs to zero, that's easy because tariffs are already expressed as prices. So to a modeler, that's great. I mean, in some ways, deep down modelers love Donald Trump because he loves tariffs, right? And price effects are always the easiest to get at. However, if you look at many of these agreements, by far the most important things are not tariffs. They're non-tariff barriers and behind the border barriers, things that affect foreign direct investment in these things. So, and for that, you need to codify things, and you need to say, okay, to what degree is, our investment, is investment being liberalized? To what degree is trade being facilitated? For example, in RCEP, you'll see that Europe gains. Now, you ask yourself, how could it be that Europe's not part of the agreement, and it no doubt is going to suffer from some trade diversion because they're giving preferences to each other? How could Europe gain? And the reason is because when these countries get together and they lower the cost of trade, of the costs of goods arriving into a port, of greater efficiencies in terms of preparing things online and reducing customs forms and these things, that kind of trade facilitation benefits don't just accrue to the members, it accrues to everybody. And so Europe gains from a spillover effect, both in terms of, to some degree, the income effect, but mostly because it benefits from those spillover effects. If you look at the economic effects of the European single market, for example, 60% of the modeling that was done had nothing to do with tariffs because it was already a customs union, and it had a common external tariff. It's not about that. It's about all these other things. So you benefit also externally from these greater efficiencies, and this does have effect on foreign direct investment. We look at foreign direct investment flows. So you do have the benefits of a more efficient allocation of resources, and you do have the benefit of foreign direct investment, more efficient allocations of foreign direct investment and whatnot. So these are some of the things that are behind those numbers.
Thank you, Mike. And I think, we've run out run out of time. We've been surprisingly disciplined for once. So thank you very much again for your presentation and for being available to answer most of the answer. We'll see that with extended interest in the topic, so we'll do more in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It was a lot of fun. Bye-bye.